Hi everybody, welcome to your basic overview of photosynthesis and cell respiration. Before we get started, I do want to stress that this is simply a very general description of these two processes. We will get into these in much more detail in class, so if you're a little confused by the things that we're talking about, don't worry. We'll clarify those with some diagrams and other different enrichment activities to help you understand. So first of all, looking at photosynthesis. So photosynthesis takes place in plant cells only in an organelle known as the chloroplast. So this process uses energy from the sun to convert water and CO2 into oxygen and glucose. And let's take a look at our formula. So we have water, carbon dioxide, the sun powers it, you get oxygen and glucose. And if you don't already have this formula memorized, C6H12O6, you definitely need to understand that that means glucose. When we look at photosynthesis, before we get into the details of the process, we need to talk about the chloroplast itself. First of all, you may wonder, why is a chloroplast green? Well, they're green because they reflect red and blue light and absorb green light. And something called chlorophyll is inside of them, which is what helps with this whole process. So looking at our structure over here, one of these little discs or circles is known as a thylakoid. And they look like, some people say pancakes. They always make me think of sprees, like the little candies. Okay, and a whole stack of them is known as a granum. And if you have several stacks, it's plural, a grana. Lastly then, you have the stroma. So this is the open space where the second part of the photosynthesis reaction takes place. All right, so let's dig into these two reactions. So we have the light dependent and the light independent, otherwise known as the Kelvin cycle. So the light dependent is just that, it depends on the light. So the light is going to strike the chlorophyll, which is inside of the chloroplast, and then it's going to produce oxygen, which is a byproduct. We sometimes selfishly think that plants do photosynthesis to make oxygen for us. That is not the case. They do it to make glucose for themselves, but we benefit from their oxygen for sure. They also make NADPH and ATP, and these are both sources of energy to help power the Kelvin cycle or the light independent reaction. So this ATP and NADPH move into the stroma, which if you remember is that space. It provides the energy needed for the reaction. CO2 is also going to enter the stroma, and as a result, at the end of the Kelvin cycle, we get glucose, or that formula you need to remember, C6H12O6. All right, well, there's also cell respiration. So photosynthesis is plants. Cell respiration, we tend to focus on just animal cells doing it, but it's important to note that plant cells do cell respiration as well. And this time, it's taking place in the mitochondria. And we're breaking down glucose to produce energy. Well, everyone knows, right? Mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell, makes energy. So cell respiration takes place here because that's where all the energy is made in the form of ATP. And if you notice, you see the oxygen being taken in as well as the glucose. As a result of your reaction, you're getting water, CO2, and look at all that ATP to help power cell functions. So before we move on, let's talk about ATP a little bit more. First of all, what does it even stand for? Well, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. And the structure of it is an adenosine molecule with a ribose and then 3 phosphate groups. And this is the source of all energy for the cell. Well, how the energy is produced is when one of those P's breaks off, it turns into a DP or diphosphate, and that releases energy. So this structure up here is a triphosphate. If this one breaks off, now you get ATP and energy has been released. Okay, so cell respiration has two different pathways it can take. It can take an aerobic pathway or an anaerobic pathway. So aerobic pathway is when you have oxygen present. So it's going to start here with glycolysis. The process itself uses 2 ATP, and it breaks that glucose into 2 separate pyruvate molecules. Well, it produces 4 ATP, but our net actual ATP count so far is only 2, because 2 have to go back to power the next round. So after glycolysis, we move into the Krebs cycle. So here's where oxygen enters, and pyruvate's going to cycle through, and we release CO2, which, as you know, we breathe that out, and you also get 2 ATP. So far in this process, our total ATP count is up to 4. So we have 2 from glycolysis and 2 from Krebs cycle. Now we move on to the big one, electron transport chain, or you may see it referenced a lot as just ETC. So hydrogen ions are pumped across the membrane, and this, as a result, creates 34 ATP, which is huge. So far, we only have 4 total, and ETC makes 34. You also have water released here. So our total ATP at the end of all 3 of these processes is up to 38, which is great. The cells definitely need all of that ATP. Well, as I mentioned, there's also anaerobic. So anaerobic starts here. It starts with glycolysis, the same thing. You get 2 pyruvate molecules, you get 2 net ATP, because remember 2 have to go back for the next round. But this time there's no oxygen, so no O2, right? There's no oxygen. So instead of going to the Krebs cycle, we're now gonna have to go into fermentation. And the purpose here is to regenerate NAD+, which can then hopefully be used when oxygen becomes present again to start producing more ATP in the electron transport chain. But there are 2 types of fermentation you need to be aware of. There's alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. So bacteria and yeast cells will do alcohol fermentation. This is actually how things like beer and stuff like that is made, is through alcohol fermentation. But lactic acid, you're probably really familiar with that. If you've ever had sore muscles, right? You get lactic acid buildup in your muscles. That's because you are doing anaerobic activities. Things like sprinting, for example, would be an anaerobic activity. Well, hopefully then you've now seen some connections, right? This is the formula for photosynthesis. Well, that looks an awful lot like this formula, which is the photosynthesis for cell respiration. So why are they so similar? Well, easy enough, they're interconnected. So if you look at this diagram over here, you see that's what's coming out of the chloroplast is what goes into the mitochondria. So the products of photosynthesis become the reactants of cell respiration. Well, it keeps cycling because now the products of cell respiration go on to be the reactants of photosynthesis. So it's all a big cycle. So these 2 processes are very interconnected and they do rely heavily on each other. All right, so we're all set with the basic overview. We're going to get into much more detail in class.